Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. For over 36 years, Brooke Workman has been teaching English to high school students both here and abroad. His years of teaching are an important part of Iowa City West High's history. The school opened its doors in 1968, and Dr. Workman was there at the beginning. His hallmarks as a teacher are innovation, excellence, and integrity. He creates in-depth programs and courses that enhance the students' learning skills and expand their knowledge in the humanities. In addition to teaching, he has found time to author 5 books. Brooke Workman is a leader both locally and nationally in education. His awards and honors are numerous. I just want to mention a few. He won the grand prize from Scholastic Books for teaching with paperbacks, a Fulbright to New Zealand, the Iowa Distinguished Teachers Award from the University of Iowa in 1986, the Outstanding Iowa Teacher Award from Grinnell College 2 years later, the Distinguished Service Award from the National Council of Teachers of English in '91, and a year later he was given the Literacy Award by the Iowa Council of Teachers of English. An Iowa native, Brooke Workman received his BA and MA from what is now UNI, and his PhD from the University of Iowa. He and his wife, Marilyn, a teacher too, raised 2 children in Iowa City, Leslie and Mark. Welcome to One of a Kind.
Thank you.
Tell me about your first family, your parents.
Okay, first of all, I was born in Marshalltown, where my mother had been a nurse, by the way, at the Deaconess Hospital. They were actually living in Maxwell, Iowa. Mm-hmm. And my earliest memories, of course, of growing up in Maxwell, a town of about 800, and by the way, it's still 800 today. And we lived on right near the school for a while. We lived on Main Street.
And your father was a teacher?
First of all, he came to there to be a math teacher, and then he was a principal, and then he was a superintendent. And so he was a kind of important person in the community, I guess.
And you were a teacher's kid, not a preacher's kid.
Teacher's kid, yeah. And I always worried about my grades that I made. Not till in Marshalltown, I really believed them. Kids would say, well, you're the superintendent's son, so you're always getting good grades. And my mother once told me a story that I was unhappy with a second grade teacher, and I told her if she didn't straighten up, I'd have her fired. Yeah, and
a little power there.
And then my dad found out about that, and he got a kick out of it. So, yeah, it was a good life in a small town.
But your father left teaching, didn't he? And your grandfather was a teacher.
Yeah, actually, I'm a third-generation teacher. My grandfather was a one-room country school teacher, and he was more ambitious, I guess. He got out. He became a banker. Mm-hmm. And he wanted my dad to be an accountant. And my dad, I think, wanted to be a CPA. And there was some argument about that, and my dad ended up being a teacher, a math teacher. First in Melbourne, and then in Maxwell, where I was living as a child. So...
when did you move to Marshalltown?
Well, my dad taught in Maxwell for about 13 years. And then he got ambitious. He felt his salary wasn't good enough. And he decided he wanted to be more of an accountant. And so he went to Marshalltown, let's see, when I was about in the 6th grade. And he went there and worked for Cooper Manufacturing. They made power lawnmowers, one of the first power lawnmower companies now gone. And he was an accountant there. And that was a big move for me to move from this town of 800 to this metropolis that had buses on the streets, and they had this hotel Tallcorn. But I grew to love it there. I had a good time, a good schooling, good experience.
And then you learned that your grades were not because you were a teacher's
Yeah, I remember the first
son.
grades. I was in 5th grade when I was there, and I kept waiting for my grades, and they turned out all right, and so I was redeemed.
You were redeemed.
Yeah.
So did you, were you reading, was your nose in a book all the time, or did you do the normal things kids do in high school?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I like to read, always liked to read. My dad was a great reader. He always read it aloud to us. My mother read aloud to us. We read the newspaper in the morning aloud.
You have siblings?
My sister, she lives in Arizona, in Phoenix, and my brother lives in Virginia, and he's an insurance executive.
I read something happened from my research assistant who interviewed you before this interview, talked about that you had a high school friend that was killed in a freak accident. Was it from a tornado? What was
No, that was back in Maxwell.
Oh, that was
Maxwell was
Maxwell.
full of lots of excitement for a small town. And when I was a boy, they had a serious tornado strike the town, outside of town, a farmhouse. And one of my 5th grade friends was a farm boy living in this home, and he was getting out of the house to go find, I believe, his musical instrument, and the wind blew the car on top of him, and he was killed. And his body was brought into the town. The furniture store at that time was not only the furniture store, but also the funeral home, and he was brought there. And I remember my mother said, "I don't think you ought to go down and go down there." But I did with another friend of mine, a guy named Jack Pierce. And that was the first person I'd ever seen dead. And I remember walking into this furniture store, and there was all these sofas. And then to the door he led us into it, and it was actually the showroom on the front of the building, but they had the curtains drawn, and in the bed there was Wesley, his name was. He was lying in bed with a suit on, I remember, with a tie and lipstick. And that was an extraordinary experience for me.
Do you tell your students that in your class that you teach on dying?
Yeah, I do. I tell them about that.
Did you ever write about it?
No, I never written up about it. No.
So after back to Marshalltown, and then your father enrolled you in what is now UNI.
Yeah, well, my grandfather quit teaching, and my dad quit teaching, and all through high school he told me, "You don't want to be a teacher. You know what it's like." And he discouraged me, and when I got to be a senior, I got a scholarship at the community college, and I didn't really want to do that because everybody said that's like high school. I came down here at the University of Iowa for a Niall Kinnick scholarship. That was for a sports scholarship, and they only gave it to, I think, 2 people out of 16, and I didn't get it. And so I didn't know what I was going to do, and one day my dad said, "Get in the car," and he drove us up to Cedar Falls, to University of Northern Iowa, or what was then called Iowa State Teachers College. That seems like a very strange thing to send a kid to Teachers College if he didn't want me to become a teacher. But he said, "Well, it doesn't make any difference the first 2 years, just liberal arts." Well, I made a big mistake because when I got up there, I loved the place. I had wonderful teachers, professors for teachers, and 2 of them just fired me up. One was named Joe Fox, one of the great English teachers at UNI, and another was Leland Sage, who was a historian. And these 2 men convinced me I wanted to be a teacher, but not a high school teacher, a professor. And I think that was also the beginning of my interdisciplinary way of looking at the world. History over here, English over here, and all melding together. And then I met my wife in a humanities class, and
Appropriate.
so we got married during her senior year, and I was finishing up my master's degree in social studies.
Now, was this before the famous incident you told me about, that this initiation? Was it when you were a freshman at UNI?
Well,
tell me that story.
When I was a freshman at UNI, they had an annual tradition every fall around November, and all the seniors would come out of the dorms, go down to the freshman dormitory in those days, which was the football stadiums. Was underneath it was the dormitory for the males, and they'd come down there and yelling, screaming, and pounding on the doors, dragging us out, and march us through the cold weather, night weather, and throw us into this big pond. It was called Prexy's Pond, and we all knew it was coming, and we were all worried that there were going to be fights, and there were fights. And one of my roommates, who was a really good guy, good friend, good student, but he was always sickly. You open up a drawer and there'd be about 50 boxes of pills in there. Well, he was taken with us down there, and we were all pushed in, had to sit up to our chins and sing the fight song, then climb over the coal pile, which was right near the power plant, while they'd whack us in this cold air. A lot of them in just shorts and t-shirts. Well, I didn't like it very much, and my roommate got very ill. He was taken to the emergency to the local campus clinic, and he almost died. And I said to myself, this is going to stop. We'd had something like that in high school, too. So I kept thinking, what can I do? And I read in the Daily Iowan about the elections and offices, and I looked down there, and there was something called Traditions Chairman. And I thought, Traditions Chairman? I asked people, what does that do? And they said, well, anything on campus is a tradition you can deal with. And I said, I'm going to run for that. I ran unopposed. Of course, nobody knew what it was about. And I won. And then I went immediately over to the Dean of Students' office, and I said, we got to get rid of this Prexy's Pond deal. And he said, you're right, Brooke, but it's been around a long time, so how are you going to do it? And I said, well, I got a plan. And so the plan I figured out was, obviously it's got to be some male thing, but it ought to be fair. So I decided we'll have a tug of war on campus. The toughest freshmen against the toughest upperclassmen. We'll pull and rope, we'll dig a pit, we'll make it all muddy and wet, we'll bring in the Cedar Falls fire department with big hoses to blast on them, especially when they lose. And then afterwards we'll all clean up and go have a party on campus. And that's exactly what happened. That's one of my real triumphs.
Congratulate. I wonder if they're still doing it.
No, they're not still. Prexy's Pond has been drained, and I don't think that tradition's around anymore.
Well, that's a feather in your cap. After UNI and you'd met your wife and you were married, you were inducted into the Army, and after you were discharged, the Defense Department asked you if you wanted to go teach abroad, and you spent 6 years in Munich.
Yeah, let me kind of back up a little bit. First of all, when I got my BA and my MA, I got it in the middle of the school year. My wife was teaching at Waterloo, and she had a good job. We thought, well, that was a good job in Waterloo. And a teacher died at West Junior High School. She was 70 years old, and my wife inquired, and sure enough, I got the job. I went over on Friday, and Monday I started teaching with my master's degree. And of course, I said to myself, well, I'm doing this for the money, and then I'll move on to work some more on becoming a professor. So I enjoyed it. I had a wonderful experience, and I still hear from some of those kids I taught at West Junior High School. And then I taught one more year, and then it was around the time of the Korean War, and I was in the U.S. Army Reserve, and I had done reserve duty in Colorado, and then I came back, and there I was. I'd come back, and I went to West High School in Waterloo, and I enjoyed that a great deal, but the salary was just lousy. My wife got pregnant, and in those days, and she was a teacher, and in those days, if you got pregnant, you had to quit teaching right there. I mean, if you were showing pregnant, you had to quit. You couldn't finish the year. So my wife had lost her job. I had this lousy job with salary that I loved, and I thought, what am I going to do? And a friend of mine said to me, you know, they're having a hiring fair over at Cedar Falls at the university, which is now the University of Northern Iowa, and why don't you come along? And I said, okay, it might be kind of fun. He was a teacher of chemistry, and in those days everybody wanted science teachers. So I went over there in the big fair, and I got interviewed, and they said to me, oh, social studies and English, you're a dime a dozen, but you know, nice you came. And my friend said, I think I got a good chance. Well, he didn't get it, and I got it for some crazy reason. And so there I was hired to teach overseas. And this was like manna from heaven, because one, now I was going overseas and I had a salary that was more than I had in Iowa. They also gave me free housing. In the free housing, we had free electricity, free silverware, Huchenreuter dishes, you name it, everything. They even replaced the light bulbs, and I said, I'm in heaven, because I had this good salary, a beautiful apartment, and I was in Germany. And I was in Germany, and I had the wonderful kids. In fact, this summer I just went out to Las Vegas to see a professor out there who was one of my students. And I just got a letter a week ago of a woman who runs an art gallery in Sewickley, Pennsylvania. And she was the first one to bring over dissident art to the United States. And she was one of my students, because Munich was a center of a lot of international activity, and these students who had come across from the Iron Curtain came to my high school. So I had a wonderful time, and I stayed 6 years.
Long way from Maxwell, Iowa to Munich.
Yeah, it was.
What made you come home then?
Well, there I was. Now I had a wife and two babies. My son was born there. My son Mark, and Leslie had come over as a baby, and I kept saying, wait a minute, you know, this is hard work, this teaching high school. And I've been everywhere. I was to Egypt, I went to the Soviet Union, I'd seen everything, and I said, I got to get back and get on the road to becoming a professor. After all, I was about 32 years old, and they used to say, you know, around that time, you're going to be late for being a PhD. So I wrote Dr. Sage back in Cedar Falls, and he said he'd help me. And I won a scholarship through UNI, and I got a grant here at Iowa, and I came back. And oh God, I came back to Finkbein Park.
Yes.
The hog houses where all the students lived. And I lived there for 3 years.
Yeah.
And here I'd lived in this luxury Europe, and now I was there. My wife was not working. 2 little kids in those metal houses. My advisor left. The head of the department left the year I came back, so the only guy who was there was an MA. And I said, when was the last time they gave a PhD in American Studies? And somebody said, I don't know. And I went over and researched the University of Iowa dissertations, and that was something like 10 years ago. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I've given up this good life. I'm back here. My advisor isn't even here. But I said, I want to be a professor. Well, they came back, and things started going pretty good. In fact, I remember walking into the chair of the American Studies and saying, I'm out of here in 3 years. You imagine saying that today?
Which you were.
And I did. Yeah, I got out.
You got out in 3 years.
And I loved to write, so I wrote my dissertation on John Marquand, who was a writer that never had a rejection slip. And I thought, I got to find out how you do this. And so there I was. The only trouble, there I was, and it was summer. So I couldn't get, I just finished my dissertation in the summer, and the committee approved it, and so there were no job openings to speak of. So I said, what am I going to do? And then somebody said, I hear they got a job open on this new school over here at West High, out there in the cornfields. So I went down and interviewed, Ed Barker interviewed me, and he hired me. Went out to the school, and I walked in, and I said, tell me who the chair is at West High School. And they said, let's see, it's Brooke Workman. I I said, wait a minute. Ed Barker saved some money on me. And there I was. And it was a new school. Everything was screwed up. And some things were wonderful because we could experiment. It was a healthy environment. I taught my first semester, and then the second semester, I had a class called Poetry and Drama. And I said, what's that? And people said, you ought to know, you're head of the department. And I asked people, what is this? And they said, I don't know. I said, well, if you don't know, I think I'm going to start a humanities class. And that's what I did. And I had a bunch of kids, some of them still live in town, and we didn't have any books. All we had was a class of kids that were eager to learn and eager to experiment. So now we could have art, we could have music, we could have literature, we could have history, and all those things going. And that was the beginning of my humanities program and my writing.
And I know I've talked to many students, my own included, and that was the class they probably, remember the most at West High was that humanities class. And are you still allowing your kids to pick a decade and then they study the decade?
Yeah, the first year we did the 20s, because back in the 60s and 70s, people were really interested in that period. And then then I started thinking, my dad's era was the 30s, let's talk about the 30s. So I started a 30s class. And then I thought, well, maybe I ought to get a 50s class. And then I decided I'd do a 45 to 60s, so it's sometimes called 50s class. And then a few years ago, I decided to do the 60s.
Have you moved up to the 70s yet?
No, I haven't done the 70s yet. I think that's going to be hard to do. And right now, I'm having so much fun with I have two 60s classes right now, and one 45 to 60s class.
So you've been very innovative, I know, over the years, beginning to teach new classes when they haven't taught without a curriculum, that you kind of devised your own curriculum.
Yeah, I was lucky. I was in a school that gave me opportunities. Administrators freed me up for a lot of things. The colleagues I had were supportive. It's a wonderful community with wonderful assets for our kids to find materials. And so I decided that this was the kind of thing I wanted to do, and it just started to grow.
How did the class that I know you're known for, too, besides the humanities course, I don't know if it's a class or if it's a program or seminar, American Way of Death. How did that start?
Well, it started because we went to trimesters. We used to have 2 semesters, you know, and then we went to trimesters. So I thinking, wait a minute, am I going to do a whole year of humanities, which had originally been a semester? So I said, no, I'll do 2 trimesters. Well, what am I going to do with that 3rd trimester? And then I thought, I'm just going to open it up to all kinds of experiments. Like one year, we did nothing but the study of Chicago. And we studied Chicago. We planned a trip to Chicago. We stayed in inner city Chicago. We went up to the rich Lake Forest, Chicago. We went to art museums. We went out to Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, and we made it a Chicago experience, and it was wonderful. And then as I started thinking about things, I suddenly thought, I heard about Kubler-Ross, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and her study about death and dying, and I started thinking about the death of our first child, which was a difficult thing, and it was a 50s thing. Our first child in Waterloo died in the hospital after about 6 hours of life. And in those days, people didn't think much about grief and how to deal with things like that. They just sort of said, well, I remember they said to me, I hate to tell you, but your son has just died, and would you might as well go home. Well, I fainted. And they were giving me oxygen. It was just automatic response. And then after that, I went home, and I was there at home, and I was around with all these, the bed, the toys, the things after the showers, and my wife was up in the hospital, and they said, you know, you don't have to go up to see her. And then I went up to see her, and she had to, in those days you had to stay in the hospital 3 or 4 or 5 days, and I had to have a funeral, and luckily my mother-in-law was in town, and she helped. And that was an enormous experience. And I thought later, we've got to talk about that. There's something wrong about that. And so I started this course called The American Way of Death to bring in all sorts of people and to talk about the developmental stages you go through from childhood to adulthood and the way you look at death.
Like the first time you saw you still remember that.
The
first time
you never forget
that.
those things.
And
I have a lot of kids in my classes over the years, of course, who've come in with the loss of siblings, of parents. And even 2 years ago, I had a student in my death dying class who died during the course.
And you have them write their obituary, don't you?
Well, they keep journals, and they journal about each experience. We do a study of how media presents death and how it compares to reality. Now, there at the end, as we have built up all these experiences, then the kids, they write their own obituaries, they write their own wills. We bring in lawyers, we bring in all kinds of people, and because it's a very real course. And the wonderful people in Iowa City have supported us and come in and shared their lives. It's just so a wonderful experience.
You thought you were going to go off to be a professor, and
Right.
I know people ask, I saw an article about you, they said, well, why have you stayed in the high school? And you say, because you like, I saw the response was, quote, I like that kind of a student. What's the draw of that kind of student to you? What is that about a high school
I should
student?
back at one step. Because of what I've done in the classroom and the writing that I've done, is I was fortunate enough to be hired to teach in colleges. I have taught at the university at the American Studies 2 summers for graduate students. I have run workshops, for example, at the University of Richmond for college teachers on the humanities. So I got that experience, and when the U.S. Information Agency hired me to go around to the various countries in the world to give lectures, I got that experience, so that helped a lot. But I like high school because, first of all, I have a lot of freedom out at West High School. Secondly, I have wonderful kids that take these experiences and seem to run with them. And we've made projects. The projects the kids do in class, the end of each humanities class is a very exciting experience when the kids show their performances and products.
What's the best part of your job?
I like problem solving.
You do?
I love problem solving. And in a situation like in public schools, you're always solving problems like, how can I make this student like this a little bit better? How can I solve that problem with the way I taught the lesson? What materials or people can I bring in to fire up the kids? Today, for example, we had a play, and we could have read the play and written about it, but I had the kids enact the play in the class, and then we stop and do free writes about, okay, now let's stop at the end of that scene, write what you're thinking, what's going to happen next, how do you feel about it.
What play were you reading?
It's a play by a high school student.
Oh.
It was a prize-winning play out of New York, and it's called Women in Wallace, and it's about a young man whose mother commits suicide, and he finds her body, and he has to deal with that through the rest of this play.
Have you noticed, Brooke, over the 27 years you've been at West High, any significant changes in the attitudes or behavior of your students?
Well,
Or are they pretty much...
I kind of hate to, again, to solve that question, how do you quantify that? I mean, it's a different school now. Iowa City is a different community. The kids coming in from year to year are different in some ways, but I don't know. I see the same kind of excitement and the same kind of apathy at times, and problems to try to get them turned on to learning.
Maybe a better question would be is, have you changed? What have your change?
I've gotten a little older.
You've got, okay.
Have I changed? I work problem solving of making each kind of thing refreshing. I do kind of things to make myself refresh so that I can teach the next lesson. I do a lot of reading. I do a lot of traveling.
That's a hobby of yours, isn't it?
Yeah, and I tell a lot of stories. A lot of my kids know I tell stories. The stories are brought in from my experience to share with them experience, but also to fire them up about thinking about things that they might want to be able to try. I still like teaching. I always worry about the next year. Well, am I getting burned out? Oh, should I retire? But I still like it.
Who influenced you?
Well, I think, first of all, my dad did, and I don't think he meant to. Because he left teaching, and after he left teaching, I remember as a boy in junior high and high school, he was always getting letters from these former students telling him how much they appreciated what they'd done for him. And even though he kept saying to me, you know, Brooke, it doesn't pay anything, I think I got the message is that you can do an awful lot of good for people, and there are these kind of rewards that are intangible, but they make you feel really good. Just like I was telling you about the woman in Vegas, the woman over in Pittsburgh. I think my dad really influenced me in that way. Those two teachers in college, they fired me up. There's no doubt about that. And then when I got into teaching in the public schools, I had mentors too. When I taught overseas in Munich, we had teachers over there that were just marvelous, the greatest experimenters, do crazy things, and was just a continued excitement.
When did you decide to write? I don't know how you found the time to write 5 books, but was that in the summer?
Well, I'll tell you about writing. I was just, an average reader and writer through high school and did all right. I think I was 3rd in my class when I graduated, but it was no big deal. When I got into college, I flunked my first paper. I got an F, I've told my students. And I did 3 rewrites and the professor luckily got me up to a C+. And then one day I sat down in front of the typewriter and I said, I'm not going to write this 5-paragraph theme stuff anymore. I'm just going to write something that comes in my head about this piece of literature. And I started writing, just impassioned, turned it in. And he gave all the papers back except mine. I thought, oh God, here it comes again. And then he said, Mr. Workman, would you stand up and read your paper? And that was a marvelous experience. I got up and read, and I felt so good about myself and my writing. I said, I got to do that again. And so I thought, I want to be a writer. Then I got turned on to Thomas Wolfe. And then I learned to Look Homeward, Angel. And I wanted to be a writer like him, and to absorb all experience and bring it in. And so I started writing then. Started writing novels, short stories, poems, lots of rejection slips that I shared with my students. But eventually I think I found what I'm good at in writing. And I got pretty good at writing about learning and about school, about teaching, yeah. And I got a lot of reinforcement on that from people. And again, I was always trying to problem solve. Like my latest book is, how can I get kids better on things like mechanics, about spelling and punctuation? And I tinkered with that for 20 years before I finally got published. So I'm always problem solving, and usually you have to do it with writing.
And you probably are thinking about your next book.
Well, in the back of the mind, yeah, because I got that one, and then I got another one. It's a book about a little boy growing up in a small town of 800 when a tornado hits the town. And I've been working with my son that maybe we could turn this into a screenplay. He lives in Hollywood, and
tell me about your children, what they're doing.
Well, Mark, my oldest child is Leslie, and she works for the state legislature. She's a lawyer. She graduated from the University of Iowa Law School. And right now she does a number of things, but one of them is orients the incoming legislators. They just made a video on that. She worked on it. She helps them write bills, and like she tells me, sometimes they come in and they'll hand her 8 bills, and she'll say, well, 6 of them are already laws, and 1 of them is unconstitutional. And she's just a wonderful person, and she lives in Des Moines with her husband, who's a videographer, and my son Mark lives out in Los Angeles, and he works in an editing house, and he's working on a 5-year film that he's now down editing. So they're wonderful kids.
And your wife is teaching.
My wife she's just not a teacher. She's a lot of things. She's a wonderful teacher with kids. She does great workshops. She's right now doing reading recovery. She's been on the LARS program. She was a classroom teacher for many years here in Iowa City and in Waterloo and so on. And she's taught me a lot about learning.
Which you're now teaching your students. Lucky students.
Yeah.
Lucky students. Thank you for being my guest. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
My guest on One of a Kind has been Brooke Workman. For 27 years, he has taught English and humanities at West High School. An author of 5 books, he is a leader in education both locally and nationally. Throughout his distinguished career, Dr. Workman has received numerous awards and honors for his teaching methods. Known as an innovator, scholar, author, and outstanding teacher, Brooke Workman inspires and challenges his high school students. Our community is indeed fortunate that he teaches in Iowa City. Brooke Workman is one of a kind.